For this tutorial, we're going to be using XGen Interactive Groom, which is part of Maya. This is what I use professionally and what I will always recommend. This is an example of what the kind of thing that we're going to end up with. As you can see, it starts with the thick, chunky hair cards and then gradually gets thinner and thinner, going into more flyaways. I will show you exactly how to do this, so don't worry if you don't know how. You can use different softwares, things like Fibershop and XGen Core and anything else you may use, but again, I really recommend XGen Interactive Groom. So now I'm going to walk you through how I create my hair cards in XGen from start to finish. So to begin with, I'm going to create the plane that my cards will originate from. So what I'm doing here is creating a slight bend so that, as I've shown here, we'll get a nice transition at the top of the cards. We don't want it to be cut off really harshly. And doing this as an origin really helps with that. So we're going to want to go from Maya Classic to XGen Interactive Groom. And we'll get this window here. Then we're going to generate, create interactive groom splines. Name your description, so I'll just call it Hair 01. Density, let's try it 10. Length, we'll go for 100, see how that comes out. The width you may want to change, and the CV count we'll leave at 5 for now. Like a decent length. So now what we want to do is go into the description here, open that up, go into sculpt, make sure edit is red, go into our tools here, and I like to just brush this down and make it all straight. So as you can see, the thing with XGen Interactive Groom is you're working directly with the hair and grooming it like this. For a full head of hair, for a full hairstyle, it will probably end up being quite tricky, but for what we need, I find it gives you really good freedom and really the ability to change tiny little things on the fly and isn't too technical. So now that I've brushed that down straight, I'm just going to go and have a look here. I like to add a taper, which is here under shape. As you can see, that just thins out the end of the hair. And then I go to the top and add a little width ramp here, just for the root, just so that it's not super chunky and weird looking. So as I'm sure you know, you need, and as I showed earlier, you need to start with a big chunky hair card that will be serve as your base. So looking at my reference, I'm going to try and find an example of a sort of what I'm going for. Now you're not really going to see the base card, but it's important to still make it look relatively visually appealing. I'm going to look at something like this here. So as you can see, it's quite a dense amount of hair, but it's got some nice little chunks in it here. So I'm going to try and reproduce that. I'm going to use the move brush to just change the shape a bit. So I'm going to begin by changing the CV count, which is basically the try count. I'm going to put it up to 50. So now I've got a lot more to work with. And I'm going to add a modifier just to get me started. So now I can go into these modifiers and tweak the settings into something that I want. So I don't want these clumps to be too thin. I still want it to keep a lot of the density. So I'm actually going to remove that and do it by hand. So what I'll do is I'll add another sculpt layer just to keep it all clean and separate. And I'll go in with the clump tool. Change my settings here just to make sure I get all of the hairs. And I will hold down with my little clumps. A little bit difficult to see at this stage, but as we go, you'll be able to see more of what you're doing. And give myself some big clumps to start off with. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a noise modifier, which is super helpful. So I can go in and change the frequency and the magnitude. These are the main settings that I play with. So magnitude, you can see there's some frequency changes how tight those will all be. I usually go lower on the frequency, a little bit higher on the magnitude. Change where it's affected. Get down a lot more. And then again, I'm going to sculpt layer. I'm going to get the freeze brush and just freeze a little selection of these hairs. And then have another sculpt layer. Invert frozen effect. And now I can pull just these little strands around. So I'm not very happy with how this is looking right now. I think I've done the clumps too tight. So I can go into my sculpt layer and actually just turn this down. A lot more natural. So I can just tug at the bottom here and that will straighten out all those little wobbly edges I have. It's good to twist around and check it out from the other angles as well, because where this fits like this will come out in your bakes. So you want to consider that and make it look as natural as possible. No hair is super flat all the time. So you can't see, but as I'm doing this, I'm just glancing over to my reference board just to keep it grounded and give me an idea of where I want to go with it. So I'm pulling out the shape because I don't want it to be super straight. So obviously our hair cards will be limited with the shapes we can go. It's obviously still geometry. So what you can do, and what I try to do, is make the hair cards as interesting as possible so that we get more out of our geometry. The benefit of interactive groom will come more into play with the lighter hair cards that we do, but you can probably tell by now, like, you get so much more control and freedom over there. It's a little bit annoying if you got to keep doing it over and over again, but I think the benefit outweighs the tediousness. As you can see, I'm kind of layering up these. I'm putting these under here like this, just so that we get nice, interesting bakes. So at the moment I've got really obvious gaps as well, which I'm trying to fill. We can have some gaps, but generally, as this is a base layer, you don't want anything showing through. This is just going to cover your head. Now I've got that first path. I'm going to add another sculpt layer and create a few more clumps. Another way of doing this is just to freeze the little section that you want. Make it into a clump. Go into tool settings. You can invert frozen effect. So this means that you're just editing the frozen bits. So again, what I'm doing here is just doing my best to add interest via layers and shapes and things, even in these early card stages, because this will just help with the final look and aid your geometry at the end. Get as much out of it as possible. So again, this gap just here is not the kind of thing we want in our base layer. I'm just gonna cover that up. Little bits like this fine, but not big chunks. The thing is as well with these early cards is that they're going to be the most repeated along your head. You don't want any unique features that are obvious. If I have a big unique hole like that, you're going to notice it. I'm feeling like it's a little bit wobbly at the moment, so I'm just going to tug it from the bottom, straighten out that. Again, you want to be checking it from all angles, moving it around like this to catch the light. A bit weird here. I'm just gonna So again, I'm going to add another noise filter just to give me more of those shapes that I can't sculpt by hand. Create the magnitude over the frequency of it. Depending on the style of the hair is depending how much noise you want. So if you've got really frizzy hair, if you want it to look a bit unkempt, add lots of noise. But if you want it smooth and nice like a lot of these, you don't want to add too much noise. So I've got an obvious gap in the middle down here. which I'm not liking and I think will stand out, so I'm just going to go in another sculpt layer, reuse a bit, trace from the top. So I think that'll do for now. So next we're going to focus on the bottom tip of the hair. So clearly you don't want every ends of your hair to be straight and blunt like this. You want to have a nice taper, and the bottom of your base cards will actually be seen a lot more. So what we're going to do is change the length of these hairs down here to get something more like this, something a little bit less uniform. We can do that in two different ways. One, we can use the cut modifier, and this will cut the hair. We can add a mask like this, go into noise, and as you can see, it won't cut it the same way. Give it a nice bit of variation. And then I'm also going to go in with another sculpt layer and use the length brush, or length tool, which will literally add length where you paint, like this. So you want to be careful when you use this. Obviously you don't want to do it all across the hair, you just want to do it in little sections. But at the moment I'm being limited by how long the base strands are, so I'm gonna cut it even more. And again, this is all on a sculpt layer, so you can change it if you change your mind later. I think I'm happy with that for now. And another thing I like about interactive groom is that, for example, now this noise has given me some little bit more flyaways coming out here. So what I'm actually going to do is grab some of these and then pull them out by hand. Just to emphasize them. And I love having this amount of control specifically, like you can get really nice looking flyaways, exactly what you want. Make them as pretty or as chaotic as you want them to be. And I've always found this to be so much harder with things like fiber shop and stuff, you just don't get that same control. Now obviously we don't want to put too many flyaways in our base card, but just a little something here to help break up the edges is really useful in helping the whole thing look a lot more natural. I'm not quite happy with how straight these bits just here look. I'm going to edit those. Again, you want to avoid super straight strands, like you're never going to see perfectly straight strands in your hair, so taking that all out of the cards now really makes an impact in the realism of your hair. Again, we don't want anything too unique like this because it'll stand out when you repeat your cards. I'm just going to push that in. Yeah, it's still looking a bit too uniform to me, so I'm just going to reduce even further the clumps that I've got and just use those to break those shapes a bit more. And then we can also add another noise modifier, which will again break up any straight bits that we don't like without having to do it by hand. Okay, so I think that'll work for our base card. Now I'll move on to the next one. So now we've got the base card. The next two cards I'm going to make are going to be quite dense still, but a little bit less, basically. In my example here, I did a hair breakdown for my orc. You can see the way I use the cards. So this is the base layer, and then the next two, these two here, I used for creating the shapes a little bit more. So obviously we want them to be relatively dense, but we don't want them to be so thick and obvious like that. So all I've done is just to duplicate these. Unfortunately, we can't just duplicate this whole description and go from there. We have to start from scratch, basically. That's fine. This way, two, and then we're going to change the density a little bit. This isn't set in stone. We can always change this after. That don't look right. So again, make sure edit is on, because otherwise you'll edit the wrong one. Brush it down. So we can actually go into hair number 1 and copy these settings just to make sure that they're all the same. So I'm going to look at my reference again and try and find an example of what I'm going for. So these cards we'll use mainly for the shape of these layers here. So we'll use them as the foundation. So that's what I'm looking for when I look at my reference. Another thing to note is that we don't want too much bend like this unless we're going for a really curly hairstyle. We do want them to be going straight down, especially on a straighter hairstyle like this. So I'm actually going to use the noise modifier this time to help inform the direction I want to take with this. So what I'm going to do is freeze sort of like the top layer. And then I'm going to move all the bits underneath. Be sort of clump them together. So I'm generally happy with this, but as I'm looking now, I can see this clump here, and I think that's going to be really streaky and obvious when we really start to repeat these cards along the style, and you're going to really be able to tell. So I'm just going to go in here and manually break it up a little bit. Okay, so now we're done with our 3 main hair cards. We're going to create the next part. So in this example, my orc hair again, I use the next card to help build up the main interesting part of the hair, I suppose, like these extra layers here. It's going to vary from hairstyle to hairstyle exactly what you want to use these for, but I like to use them to make it's what I would describe as the main bulk of my hair, the main interest. So, these are just base layers to me. So, I'll be using this one for all these different layers. That's what's going to mainly make up it, because from the side angles you can see they're not, you can't tell there's a thick piece of hair behind them. If you use the base cards for something like this, they're going to be really chunky and obvious. And in some parts that'll work, but generally you're going to want a lot thinner hair card. So again, this one's going to be thinner than all the rest, less dense. Similar kind of vibe, but again, less dense. So now these are getting into more individual cards, I suppose. I'm not going to clump as much individually on this card because this is going to stand alone. You're going to see a lot more of it. These ones are kind of faking the depth in the layers, whereas these ones are actually the layers. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So with this one, I'm going to focus on adding just one overall clump like this. Just taper it in a bit. Oops. And then I'm going to start gradually pulling bits out from the side to get a more interesting silhouette. So this might be looking like it's a bit messy at the moment. I'm going to leave it for now and see what happens once I finish pulling it around, but I might turn down the noise because again this is going to look really frizzy when it's placed on top of the other cards. Yeah, definitely too noisy. And I also think it's a little bit too dense. With another sculpt layer just to keep things separate. Something that I've really learned to value over my time of doing hair is actually really putting in the work to make these hair textures interesting and work for the exact style that you're looking to go for. It's very easy to just generate hair cards, especially with software like Fibershop and things. But I think doing this and, you know, proper like nitpicking and pulling things apart and getting things exactly how you want them to look and look visually appealing makes all the difference when it comes to your final hair cards. Well, your final geometry, final look, final groom, whatever you want to call it. Which is why I'm spending so long just pulling and tweaking every little individual card and making sure I like the way it looks. Which again, X-Gen Interactive Groom really lends itself to. Not the fastest, but you don't need it to be the fastest. You want to spend a lot of time on this. As tedious as it can be. I've just realised my whole thing is kind of slanting off to the side a bit. Might not be the only one. I'm just going to pull it straight because this will just help with baking and things. Again, if you're working with a really curly hairstyle, you want to get as much curl in the textures as possible to save yourself the geometry, because otherwise all of your curl is going to be coming from the geometry, whereas if you do it more in textures, you can fake it a lot easier. But for this is quite a straight hairstyle, so we want to keep these going straight down. I feel like these cards are looking a bit bumpy, like this. And I don't think that really matches what we're going for, so I'm going to just calm those down a bit. They can still be poking out, but again, we want less up and down. And just tug at it from the bottom, and that should straighten the whole thing out. So this one I'm going to try just doing an overall straight cut and then actually manually lengthening the ends this time, because I want a bit more control. Might not like it, but we'll see. Alright, this is looking a little bit straight, so yeah, I'm going to go back in like that and just give it a little bit of a bend. So next again, going thinner as per usual. Keep looking at your reference, obviously. Just kind of getting an inspiration for what I want to do next. Making sure that the cards that I do have will give me this sort of effect. So this bit here, for example, I think I could quite easily make out of this. Again, with these, I think that'll be good with that. One of these on top, and then a couple more lighter ones. I think I may make some individual, ever so slightly thicker than this perhaps, just for bits like this that properly break up and sit on top of these layers. I think they'll work quite well as individual cards, and then we can properly use them to split you know, imagine thin little cards here, things like this, silhouette breaking. It'll be easier to just do this with one card rather than trying to build it up out of lots of thin flyaway ones. Again, this is something that comes with experience, but you may decide as you're working on your hair that actually I need one of these extra cards that will do this job, so that's totally fine too. So I'm going to make that thin individual card that I just explained. I'm going to make this thinner. Again, there's sort of general rules when it comes to hair cards. You've got your thick, your base layers, your this and your that, but it all really comes down to the exact style that you're making and your best judgment for that style and what you think you're going to need. And sometimes if I'm making a new style that I've never really tried before, I leave a little bit of space on my texture sheet just so I can come back and add things later on that I might not realise that I need. So this shouldn't need too much manual sculpting work on it. I'm going to focus mainly on the noise. Give it one tiny manual clump in the middle. Like so. So since this card's going to be more of a standalone card that I'll be using to add interest on these sort of top layers like this, I'm actually going to add a little bit more interest at the bottom than I usually would and give it a little bit more flair. Again, nothing crazy, but you can afford to make it a bit more exciting. So I'm just flicking the ends out here. So something that's just occurred to me that isn't necessarily applicable to this hairstyle, but maybe for your other hairstyles, if you're not following exactly along to this, is considering the length of your hair cards. So for this style, you never ever see one hair card going from the top all the way to the bottom. It's cut into lots of little layers, it's hidden in short little sections. But something I ran into with my org was the length of the cards here, and something I didn't really do very well and that I would do differently if I did it again was make these a lot longer and have a little more interest going down the card, because if you've got something so short like this and then you extend it into a really long style like this, the hair card texture itself can look quite stretched. So yeah, if you make this longer and kind of fill your texture sheet with lots of long pieces, you'll benefit from it a lot more because there'll just be plenty more going on. You know, nothing will get stretched, and I think it'll look a lot better. But again, for this style, lots and short bits. Never see it too long, so it's not, don't have to worry about it too much. But yeah, now this card's done, I'm going to make a few more flyaways. I'm not going to follow anything in particular now on the style. These are more functional things just to create the look, rather than following the exact reference. So yes. So as an example of the function of these cards, again, I'm going to refer back to my orc hair breakdown. You can see the green ones here. I think it's these. But what I use these for is to kind of disguise the strands that I make. So I'd like to, you'll see later on in the tutorial, but I like to use these cards to sort of block out my style. You know, I don't use sculpts, I don't use things like that. I like to use the hair cards themselves to block things out. So I'll place hair cards like this. They'll look very strange and strandy for a time, but then I fill them out with lighter hair cards like this and actually make it into more of a clump, I suppose, and disguise the fact that it's a card. So that's what these next couple of hair cards that we're going to be making will serve. Already this is looking way too dense, so we'll change that in a bit. So an example, a good teaching moment, I suppose. When you change the density multiplier down like this, you can see it takes away strands sort of disproportionately. And this can end up, you know, you'll end up with a lopsided card, or you'll end up with big streaky cards, which you really don't want. So you can take away like this, and then manually you can go into add a sculpt layer just to be safe, and you can use the density tool up here. Change the size. Oh, also it's hold down B and drag with your left click mouse to change the size, in case you didn't know that already. Go into tool settings, so I want to decrease strength. I'll show you, if I leave it at 100, I click and it removes them all. Whereas if I take it down, oh, there. Nope, that's not doing it. You can see I get a little bit more breathing room to work with. So yeah, you can manually take it down like, well, take it down like that, and then manually remove a few more cards. And I just try and make sure there's a relatively even distribution. Now look. Yeah, and we still want, it kind of counts as a flyaway, but it also counts as a, what I would call, I suppose, a supporting card. So we want it to be not very dense, but still dense enough that it will do something. So with this, I don't really need to do much. I just add a noise modifier as per usual. And that should do the job. Now I've got these hair cards, I'm actually going to ponder my reference a little bit and decide what I think I need next. So obviously I'll need more flyaways, but I may need some more individual kind of unique cards. So looking at my reference, because of the short layers here at the top, you get a lot of flyaways obviously, but the flyaways kind of have, how to describe it, I suppose, more density than usual. So things like this, I would not want to be using, you know, a hair card with one or two strands on it to do all of this. So I think what I'm going to do is create a few different flyaway hair cards that have a lot of different densities to them. Not quite like this because this is more of a support card, but somewhere in between this and a really sparse flyaway, just so I can really build up this top bit like this. So this is another example of the density thing. It's taking away too many cards from this, too many strands from this side and not enough from this side. So instead of taking it down like that, I'm just going to do it by hand with the density tool. So here the noise modifier is kind of giving me enough to work with, but I don't like the way these kink here, and I don't like the way the tips end. So here I'm just going to go in by hand and move all these around into a shape that's kind of appealing to me, I suppose. And while I do this, I'm actually going to take the CV count back down, just to give me a more clean, I suppose, cleaner edit. But yeah, like this, I can just go in one by one, freeze them, and then change what I don't like. And that's why I love interactive boom. And you should. So this does pretty much what I want it to do. I'm going to make one or two more variations of it, I think, just because I'll be using it so repetitively on the top. I don't want it to get obvious, so they'll be quite similar, but just slightly different shapes. And then finally, I'm just going to create my last few flyaway cards. So because these will be used across the hairstyle, I don't want them to be quite as wavy as these. So I'm just going to add a little Another thing that I want to emphasize is that XGen, it can be a bit buggy, it can be a bit temperamental, so I would recommend saving in increments as you go, just in case file gets corrupted, which has happened before. It doesn't happen as much now, but it has happened to me before, so I recommend. So another sort of tip, I suppose, is when it comes to flyaways, I like to have a couple or like 3 strands on one card, but I also like to have one singular one as well. So I usually just combine these, make them far enough away that I can UV this off and use it as a singular card if I want to. Make it just a tiny bit straighter. This is for like really specific flyaway hairs. Like I don't use it that much, but it can be helpful just to have as an option. And there we go. I think that is about all we need for this style. Obviously, like I said, maybe as you're working, you might decide and find out that you need a few more cards. This happens to me all the time, even still. But I think for now, we've got enough to be working with. Maybe I will tweak some things once we've done the bakes. But yeah, I think for now we're good.